Now, the Act was introduced by a Labour government, and at the time that the Act was created, the feminist movement had a serious backlash, and it was fairly inactive. So no one was pointing out that the Act was a problem at that time. I was in Australia, and I didn't find out about the Act until after it was passed. I then researched and wrote an article criticising the Act, which was published in 2008. I couldn't find any criticism of the Act at all to mention in my article, so I had to work it out myself. Now, the Act was the result of the activism of trans rights campaigners. It resulted from a dramatic change in the understanding and terminology that was applied to men who were masochistically excited by pretending to be members of the underclass of women in the 1990s. Before the 1990s, men's cross-dressing behavior was understood as a sexual perversion by sexologists, the scientists of sex, and it was called transvestism. It was an occasional practice carried out by men on weekends away and at special clubs. These transvestites did not pretend to actually be women. They were hobbyists. They didn't take drugs or have amputations, and they didn't have political demands at that time. A very small number of men who claimed to actually be women were called transsexuals, and these men were subjected to drugs and surgery. Some of them were simply transvestites who went too far, got carried away, one might say, and others were unhappy homosexuals who wanted to have relationships with men who saw themselves as straight, and if possible, to marry so that they could imitate heterosexual couples. There were some women, but very few, who sought to be transsexuals at that time, but for very, very different reasons, and usually because they were unhappy lesbians. In the 1990s, a movement of trans rights activists developed, which was fueled by queer theory and the sex industry. Queer theory argued that something called gender could be changed at will, and that such flip-flopping was transgressive. The understanding that transvestism was a sexual perversion was a hindrance to these transvestites. These new activists wanted to get rid of the stigma of being sexual perverts, so they created the idea that they were not sexually motivated, but in fact possessed of something called a gender identity. They claimed to be a special kind of person and demanded rights to what they called gender expression. This sounded better than a sexual perversion and would allow them to demand that their impersonation of women must be sexually accepted and perhaps even celebrated. The men's rights movement, that is transgender activism, is not a social movement in the sense that this is usually understood. It did not progress by educating the citizenry, as is the case with movements to establish women's rights, such as the rights to abortion, or disability rights, or gay rights, or the rights of ethnic minorities. As a general rule, public opinion is changed by public education over years to the point at which legislation is brought into line with a new understanding, such as happened with gay marriage. The legislation to pretend that men can become women, on the other hand, seems to have received little publicity. A cross-party parliamentary forum on transsexualism was set up in 1994 in the UK, and work began between politicians and campaigners to promote the practice. This is the behind-the-scenes way in which this legislation, which the public, after all, was likely to reject, has been pushed through in most countries. So it happened quietly within Parliament and behind the scenes. Now, in order to get the legislation through, an understanding was created that transvestites were a minority, a special rights-bearing group of people who needed to be protected. But in fact, of course, this was an invented minority. It's actually, there's no such thing as a transsexual. The Labour government of the time said it was required to introduce the legislation in order to bring the UK into accordance with European human rights law. But creating a law which is absurd and based upon a lie could surely have been avoided. The legislation at the time was seen, and the campaigners all say now, it was the most progressive in the world, and the government prided themselves upon it. But other countries were not rushing at that time to pass this legislation. Now, this is the preamble to the Gender Recognition Act, which was introduced in the House of Lords, not the House of Commons. And this is how the government introduced it. They said, the Gender Recognition Bill is a part of the government's commitment to reforming the Constitution so that it better meets the needs of all people. It also reflects our commitment to social inclusion. It is essential that no one is left behind as we create the conditions for a credible and effective modern democracy. So there you are. This bill was necessary to modern democracy. There is a strong tradition of legislation in this country that has sought to respond to the concerns and needs of minority groups, whether these be ethnic minorities, people who are disabled, or now, with this bill, transsexual people. It's interesting that it says transsexual there, not transgender, of course. I believe that this is a reformist tradition of which we can be proud, although, of course, it leaves out women. But the idea that transsexuals are just ordinary, respectable minorities, transvestites rather, that like gay men, is very problematic. In fact, of course, transvestites are motivated to imitate women, men who see themselves as transvestites, transsexuals, and so on, by sexual masochism. And there are many other men's sexual perversions which are similarly motivated. So I think it's worth asking, would the government think it necessary in this grand reforming tradition in order to support democracy to create legislation to recognize and protect men who have other sexually masochistic perversions? It does seem unlikely that any government would want to pass legislation entitling these other groups of men to protection of the expression of their masochistic fantasies. Many men, for instance, are interested in age regression. Men from the ABDL, adult baby diaper lover community, would like more acceptance of their interest and protection in law. In just one example of the suppression of their rights, as they would probably see it, in 2022, a woman went to the family court to get her ex-male partner excluded from access to his children because he was getting more deeply involved in his perversion and collected the children from his partner with his nappy partly on view, although he had an agreement with her that he would keep his interest hidden. She said this constituted a risk to the children, and she won that case. Now, the government is unlikely, I would think, to think that they should extend him protection, although this is a very, very similar perversion to transvestism. I wrote in my 2022 book, Penal Imperialism, about cases in which men demanded that women change their dirty nappies, something that gives these men exquisite sexual excitement. The women sexually harassed in this way have included university lecturers and carers. So it could be that these men would like to be able to enforce the nappy changing on the women they come into contact with in these ways, and the government could pass legislation to say that women actually must change these nappies. Now, a man's baby identity is not yet respected in the law, even though it would be a female baby identity because their baby identities are always female. It's a variety of transvestism, transgenderism. Other masochistic fantasy identities are not protected either, such as those that feature disability, the practice of getting surgeons to cut off the healthy legs of male practitioners of apotemnophilia, or sexual excitement from the amputation of limbs, and not just penises, as sometimes is the case in transgenderism, was stopped in the UK in 2000. So that was actually stopped taking off legs. Masochistic perversions that feature the imitation of race for sexual purposes are not protected by law, and I don't see them being soon protected by law. In fact, the protection of men's sexual perversions in law inevitably damages the human rights of those categories of actually disadvantaged person that the men are imitating for their pleasures. The rights of women, the disabled, ethnic minorities, children are harmed by the demands of these white able-bodied men that they should be included in these groups for the purposes of their erections. The politics of equality, as we have always understood them, are made absurd and unworkable by the demands of the male sex right. Under the 2004 Act, a person may apply for recognition of their acquired gender by appearing before a panel which will decide whether to recognize them or not. The panel must grant the application if the following conditions are met by the applicant. They must have or have had gender dysphoria, have performed what is usually called the real-life test, i.e. lived in the acquired gender throughout the period of 2 years, ending with the date on which the application is made, and intend to continue to live in the acquired gender until death. I mean, all of these things are very absurd, of course. The idea that anyone can promise never to change their minds about something which is entirely fantastic, in other words, a temporary state of mind, is absurd, and just one way in which the legislation is unworkable, because there would need to be facilities for men to be popping in and out. Of course, that would be changed with self-ID. I guess they can just pop in and out of the office day by day. As we know, there are, of course, many detransitioners, and so people change their minds about this all the time. The applicant must provide evidence of their acquired gender in the form of either a report made by a registered medical practitioner practicing in the field of gender dysphoria, and a report made by another registered medical practitioner, or a report made by a chartered psychologist practicing in that field, and a report made by a registered general practitioner. The legislation does not require that applicants should have undergone medical treatment in the form of hormones or surgery, and that's one of the ways in which this legislation was seen as tremendously progressive at the time. There's no definition in the Act of what gender means, unfortunately. In fact, there is, as we shall see, profound confusion. The Gender Recognition Panel has to exercise their own preconception of correct gender behavior, advised, of course, by the practitioners. And I don't know if a man retains his beard, for instance, as many do, and makes no attempt to look like whatever they think of feminine gender is, would they be rejected by the panel? And apparently some are rejected, but I don't know if it's for that reason. Or would a man shave for the occasion and wear a skirt just so he can pass the recognition test? Apparently they do get, or did get, advised about what to say. So they do get some training, and it might say shave beard and that kind of thing. Now, so in terms of the definition of gender and what creates it, the civil servants and the politicians who created the legislation did not believe that gender was biological, as so many politicians seem to believe now. A consultation was held on how to meet the demands for gender rights in legislation, and this reported, it was set up by the Home Office and it reported in 2000. A call was sent out for submissions to physicians who specialized in the area and in effect proselytized for the campaigners. And a call was sent out to pressure groups that have been set up to promote the practice, 7 of those in the UK. The Act is very much the child of an international movement of transgender activists represented in the UK by organizations such as Press for Change, the Gender Trust, the FTM Network. The two main campaigners from Press for Change were a man called Christine Burns and a lesbian who calls herself Stephen Whittle. And they were awarded an MBE and an OBE, these are honors, respectively, for their campaigning efforts for transgender rights and towards the GRA. It did not occur to the Home Office, who set up this consultation, that they should consult women's organizations, or that a law letting men officially imitate women could affect women in any way that mattered. It did not occur that an impact statement was needed. There was nothing about what this massive change could actually do. And they did not accept, though some of the submissions did say this, that it was biological. Some of the physicians said it was biological, but the committee that reported did not say so. The report states, the cause of the condition remains obscure. It states sensibly that gender reassignment is commonly termed a sex change, but in reality, it is an alteration only in a person's physical characteristics. The biological sex of an individual is determined by their chromosomes, which cannot be changed. That's tremendously sensible. And of course, nobody's really allowed to say that now. It's become a rather dangerous thing to say. So by the time the Act was introduced into Parliament, though, it was mired in confusion. To look at what the Home Office explains, this is 2018, in an explainer, they're saying what they say that gender actually means is very, very different from the understanding at the time. So the government has attempted to define gender more recently. This says gender is either of the two sexes, male or female. And it didn't mean that in 2000, and it's clearly, of course, extremely wrong. So somebody has changed the meaning, and the explainer helpfully gives a definition of non-binary too, which was not invented in 2004. Non-binary didn't exist. It says non-binary means that you are neither a man nor a woman. Since all humans are either men or women, this suggests that there is a category of non-humans, which are potentially werewolves. So things have gone very crazy and very different since 2004. I just want to give you a little idea of what was said in the House of Lords, because the debate is wonderful from the time. And the Tories in the debate are just splendid. They just aren't having any of it. And they say all sorts of things that nobody would be allowed to say today without getting a knock on the door from the police and so on. So this is Lord Tevitt, a conservative, very conservative peer, and he was once a minister in the Thatcher government, and he says quite sensibly, there is a major defect in the bill in its confusion over sex and gender. Is the bill about a change of sex or a change of gender? And then he says, sex cannot be changed. It's no good the minister shaking his head. You can imagine this going on in the chamber. Sex is decided by the chromosomes of a human being. If we have XX chromosomes, we are women. If we have XY chromosomes, we're men. As far as I know, there is no law or any known medical procedure that can change the sex of a human being. The bill purports to do so. It is therefore an objectionable farce. Nice language, I think. The extent of the confusion over sex and gender on the government side is revealed in contributions by Lord Filkin. He's speaking for the Labour government at the time. He says vaguely, the word sex now has more of a social and psychological connotation that it would have had 20 or 30 years ago. I don't think so. He's sort of lost biology. He's sort of forgotten biology. Then he compounds the confusion by saying the bill is about legal recognition and it will define a person's sex in law. We consider the argument about the meaning of the words sex and gender to be beside the point. There is no stark dichotomy between the meaning of the words. So in other words, complete confusion. This is he's there to explain the bill. Right? There is no definition of gender, and there's total confusion. I like her best. She's absolutely wonderful in the debate, absolutely splendid. She's still alive, I think. We should really go and see her. I don't know what she's saying now. She says, a large body of research and experience composed among others or members of the medical profession maintains that the condition is a delusion, a fantasy. The problem is psychological, not physical. Psychologists agree that. For decades, gender dysphoria has been well known as a psychological condition. There's no evidence for changing that view, apart from a form of political correctness. Political correctness is now called, I think, wokeness. But it's wonderful that she was saying this back in 2003. It's absolutely splendid stuff. So many issues that were brought up by the Conservative critics at the time spoke to the wide impact that the change in the law would have. And they spoke of the problems with sport, of course, and they were poo-pooed. So it's not until more than a decade later that the problems they spoke of, and they called cheating, turned out to be just as they had foretold. And we, as feminists, had to create huge campaigns against it.